We have an esteemed personality here today, Dr. Stanley Johny, to speak to us on the topic, the Palestine Question, Why There Is No Peace in West Asia. Dr. Stanley Johny is the International Affairs Editor with The Hindu. He has a PhD in International Affairs from JNU, New Delhi. His first book, ISIS Caliphate, From Syria to the Doorsteps of India, was published by Bloomsbury, India. His second book, The Power Triangle, is on its way from Harper Collins Publishers. He has also written for various news publications. On behalf of Dialectic Research Forum, I welcome you, sir. I also welcome the audience present here. And for the information of the audience, please switch off your microphones and video cameras. If you have any queries or comments regarding the presentation, please type them into the chat box so that they can be addressed after the talk. Please do not use your microphones, just type into the chat box. Without further ado, we'll move on to the presentation. Dr. Stanley Johny.
Thanks, Alaka. Thanks for the introduction. And thanks for having me here. So it's been a while we've been talking about, Rafiq was talking to me into this meeting for a bit. So partly because of my own laziness and partly because of the work, etc. So I mean, it's only now I could come for the presentation. And I know whatever the posters I could see about Dialectic Research Forum, I mean, you were largely dealing with social sciences or aesthetics, arts, etc., etc. Today, for a change, we can discuss international affairs. Also, I don't know what are the exact modules of your presentation. I didn't have an opportunity to attend the sessions earlier. What I would do is I would give a larger historical overview of the Palestinian issue, and then a historical overview as well as the outstanding issues that are still lingering, what is stopping, why peace is still elusive in the region, and then we will open it for a brief question and answer session. So I hope that works for everybody. And I was also told that there could be non-Malayalis as well, so that I will stick to English, the only language I can handle apart from my Thrissur Malayalam. So for everybody's benefit, we will stick to English throughout the session. Okay, having said that, let's come to the topic, the Palestine question. You see, it is, I mean, it's one of the most pressing issues in international affairs for quite some time, because the State of Israel was established in 1948 May, and it's been more than 70 years. And even before the State of Israel was established, this had been a burning issue for a long time. Even before the First World War. So the question, when we look at the Palestinian issue, the critical question, like when we were in JNU, the professor who taught us Israel-Palestine, who is a brilliant teacher and an unapologetically pro-Israel professor. So he used to tell us that the key issue while approaching Israel-Palestinian question is where to begin. What should be the beginning point? Because for Israel would say, or Israel or political scientists would say that there is a prehistoric biblical references are there, or biblical claims are there for Israel to the land of Palestine or Jerusalem, because this is largely, I mean, by the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, Jews were God's chosen people, and they were slaves in Egypt, slaves of Pharaoh, and the Hebrew God sent Moses to liberate them from slavery, and then Moses led them to the land of Canaan, the promised land, where they got their own king, King David. And David's son Solomon, he built the first Jewish temple, which was destroyed by the Babylonians. And then Herod rebuilt the temple, the remains of which are the Wailing Wall. That's what one narrative is, the Wailing Wall, which is still in Jerusalem, which is part of the Temple Mount or Haram al-Sharif, whatever you want to call it. So that is the biblical claim. And then we have the modern history of Jews being persecuted in Europe, in the Christian Europe. And then they started emigrating into Palestine, historic Palestine that was part of the Ottoman Empire. And there's immigration as a movement. They started in the late 19th century, in 1883. So that was also the time of the advent of Zionism as a political movement, So in 1896, Theodor Herzl, the founder of the World Zionist Movement, Theodor Herzl wrote this famous book, Der Judenstaat, which is the Jewish state. And in the book, his proposal was that, or his argument was that the solution to anti-Semitism in Europe, predominantly in Europe, because at that time, especially in the Tsarist Russia, we are talking about 19th century, before the Bolshevik Revolution, in Tsarist Russia and mostly in Eastern Europe. So the solution to anti-Semitism is the establishment of a sovereign state for the Jewish people. So that was the main proposal of Der Judenstaat. And then a year later, the Zionist organization, World Zionist Organization, the first political grouping of Zionists, was established. And in their first conference, they called for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. That in Palestine proposal is coming from the biblical claim, because they always thought that this is the land we belong to. And it's true that Jews were there. Jews have been there for a long time, and they've been scattered by the conflicts, because Palestine and Jerusalem specifically, we can see that it had been subjected to multiple invasions. Even now, it is still an unsettled question after thousands of years, because crusades were there. There was a Christian kingdom, a kingdom of Jerusalem, and then Salahuddin captured it in the 12th century. And after that, the Mongols came, then the Ottomans took Jerusalem, and the British took it away from the Ottomans, and it was part of the British Mandate Palestine for a long time. So this land has a history of invasions, and invasions had scattered people around the world. And it's also true that in the Ottoman Palestine, in the Ottoman Middle East, there were Jewish settlements across the Ottoman region during that time. So interestingly, in 1899, Yusuf Dia Pasha al-Khalidi, he was the former mayor of Jerusalem city, and the students of international relations or West Asian studies would may have heard of this name, Rashid al-Khalidi. So Yusuf Dia Khalidi was Rashid al-Khalidi's great uncle. So he was a former mayor of Jerusalem. He wrote a letter to Theodor Herzl in 1899, in which he says, a God who is going to deny the rights of Jews, this is your country. He says, but Rashid Khalidi also wants that. I mean, he was in theory, or he was welcome to Jews coming and settling in Palestine, but he was opposed to the establishment of a sovereign state only for Jews in Palestine, because his argument was that there is an indigenous people in this land. And at that time, even after two alayas, two emigrations, let's say if we are talking about 1917, come to 1917. 1917 is an important year, because in 1917, the British passed the Balfour Declaration. So in Balfour, Arthur Balfour was the British Foreign Secretary. And Balfour passed this declaration in which the British government, for the first time, they declared the imperial government's support for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Those are the words. the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This is basically a Zionist argument, that establishment of a Jewish homeland within Palestine. That's what the Zionist organization has called. So basically the British Empire endorsed this point in 1970. So at the time of the Balfour Declaration was announced, if you look at the population makeup of historic Palestine, it was 94% Palestinian Arabs and 6% Jews. And the 6% Jews were predominantly Jews who emigrated from Europe as part of the Alliance, fleeing persecution. They emigrated to Palestine, they bought land, they settled communities, and then they started living there. So this was the population makeup. So Rashid Khalid's great uncle's warning was that there is an indigenous population. So if we are going to set up a sovereign country, a separate country within Palestine, that would uproot the indigenous people. Rather, Jews are welcome. That was his point was. And Theodore Herzl responded to the mail, to the letter. He sent a letter back in which he says that the new non-Jewish communities' rights would never be hurt by the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. That's what Herzl had written. But interestingly, we know what happened later on. We would get to that. So the point is that in 1917, with the endorsement of the British Empire, the Zionist movement got a major impetus. So it picked up, pace. And then also, the British were very clever because why did they pass by this Balfour Declaration? Because at that time, this was passed in 1917. The First World War was, coming to its end. And the British war efforts were largely focused in this part of the world was largely focused on the Ottomans. They wanted to defeat the Ottomans. So what the British did, McMahon, one of the British diplomats, who is the same McMahon who drew the McMahon line between India and Tibet. He was a senior officer in the British Foreign Secretary. What McMahon did, he wrote a series of letters to Sharif Hussain of Makkah. So at that time, there was no Saudi Arabia, right? Saudi Arabia was established in 1930s. So Makkah, Sharif Hussain was in charge of Arabia at that time. So he wrote a series of letters to Sharif Hussain, promising that if Arabs supported the British war efforts against the Ottomans in the Middle East, in West Asia, once the war is over, Arabs would be given independence. So that was the promise the British made, McMahon made to Sharif Hussain. And then at the same time, they passed the Balfour Declaration, saying that the British government would support the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. In Palestine at that time was an Arab land. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. And then behind these two agreements, the British diplomat Mark Sykes and French diplomat Francois Picot, they got together in 1916, and then they agreed to a secret agreement which is called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Basically, the Sykes-Picot Agreement was that once the war is over, once the Ottomans are defeated, we, the imperialists, the British imperialists and the French imperialists, would divide up the Middle East and carve out our territories of influence. So this is part of history. That's what the British strategy was, that they came out with Balfour Declaration. Why? Because they wanted the support of Jews within the Ottoman territories against the Ottomans in favor of the war efforts. They also wanted the support of the international Jewish organizations, especially those Jews in the United States. They wanted them to put pressure on the Americans so that the United States would join the war. So this was the logic behind Balfour Declaration. But in effect, what happened was that Balfour Declaration became a major boost. It provided a major boost to the Zionist movement. And then also Balfour Declaration was endorsed by the League of Nations, which was established after the end of the war, because the Ottomans were defeated, the Germans were defeated, the British eventually emerged victorious from the war. And then the League of Nations also endorsed British mandate over Palestine. So the entire Palestinian territory came under the British rule. So look at this context. You have the whole of historic Palestine, an Arab land, predominantly Arab populated land, which was part of the Ottoman Empire, that now came to the hands of the British, who had publicly supported the establishment of a Jewish nation within Palestine. This is the context we are talking about now, after the war. And then they didn't immediately go for the establishment of Israel because it is a complex issue, we all know. So what the British did, under the British protection, under their tutelage, the immigration picked up pace. So let's say by 1940, the total percentage of Jews within Palestine became roughly around 40% from what was 6% earlier. And this is partly justifiable. Why? Because 1930s, it was also a time of the persecution of Jews in Europe, in Germany, in Austria, in Poland, in other countries in Eastern Europe, basically by the Nazis. So the Nazis, they started the crackdown. They killed millions of Jews in the Nazi-occupied territories. So that also, at that time, the Jews from across the world, they started migrating, en masse into Israel, into Palestine at that time. So the Jewish population in the Palestinian territories had also gone up because of the immigration at this time. And then by the end of the Second World War, after the Second World War, we have the United Nations. And then the Israel issue, the Israel-Palestine issue came to the United Nations. And the international public opinion was largely in favor of Jews, justifiably so, because Jews were the victims. They were, the horrors of Holocaust was haunting the global conscience. And this was one of the issues where both Roosevelt and Stalin agreed, or both Truman and Stalin agreed on, because everybody wanted to resolve the Jewish question, what they call the Jewish question. And then the United Nations General Assembly had set up a commission, and the commission had come up with a proposal. The proposal was to divide Palestine, because at that time, a substantial population of the Palestine territories was Jews. Jews were there. It's roughly half Jewish, and under the British mandate, the Jews in Palestine had set up a para-state. They called it Jewish Agency. So they had their own communities. They had their own state structure. They had their own militias, Irgun and Haganah. So interestingly, Haganah had carried out a series of bombing attacks in 1940s against the British. So the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which is a landmark hotel in Jerusalem, that was the headquarters of the British mandate in 1940s. That was bombed by Haganah and Irgun. And it was bombed, and many people were killed. So basically what we call today terrorism, right? You're targeting non-combatants or targeting public places. So that was, one of the tactics employed by Haganah and other Jewish paramilitary organizations in the 1940s. And the British found it extremely difficult to continue the mandate after the war because in the 1930s, Arabs rose up against the British rule, which was crushed brutally. They even used bombers to crush the Arab revolt. Rashid Khalidi has documented the horrors of the British crackdown on the Arabs, saying that 10% of the Palestinian youth in Palestinian territories were killed by the British in the 1930s. He documents this, the crackdown. So the British, from both sides, they were facing pressure. On one side, Jewish paramilitary organizations were after them because they wanted freedom. They wanted an independent Jewish state. On the other side, the Palestinians want freedom from British colonialism. So British went to the United Nations, said that they want the mandate to be vacated. Also, British Empire was, it was also the receding years after the war. Their side won the war, but thanks to the Soviets, mainly, and the British Empire was on its, receding era at that time after the war. So they wanted the mandate to be vacated, and UN, the United Nations, came up with this plan. So according to the plan, divide Palestine into an Arab country, Arab sovereign country, which is Palestine, into a Jewish sovereign country, which is Israel, and then Jerusalem would remain an independent international city. So this was the UN proposal. This proposal never got the approval of the United Nations Security Council because there was no consensus between the Jews and the Palestinians. Because Israel, the Jewish agency, which was ruling Palestinians, which was ruling Jews within the territories, the Jewish agency had welcomed the proposal, whereas Arabs, both Palestinian notables living within Palestine, as well as the neighboring Arab countries, such as Jordan, which at that time was Transjordan, and then Syria, Egypt, and other Arab countries, they rejected this proposal. So there was, this stalemate, and the UN Security Council never acted upon it. So in 1948, May 15th, the mandate was supposed to expire, the UN mandate, the British mandate. So in 1948, May 14th, the Jews, under the leadership of Ben-Gurion, they declared the formation of the State of Israel. They declared it unilaterally. And they immediately got the recognition and support from the United States. Even Stalin supported them. Stalin recognized the formation of Israel. This is and they got the recognition from the United Nations as well. But the Arab countries, they opposed because they said that this is injustice. This is this land is so yeah, I can show you the UN Partition Plan Map. That would be interesting to understand this. So yeah, I hope you can see this. So this was the partition plan. If you look at this whole region is the historic Palestine. So the UN plan was to this this should be the darker color. That should be Israel, and this yellow is Palestine, and Jerusalem. This is Jerusalem. This white patch is Jerusalem. Jerusalem would remain independent, an independent international city. And you can also see this is Gaza Strip, right? Gaza Strip is on the Mediterranean coast, and this is West Bank. West Bank is along the Jordan River. This is the Jordan River, and this is Dead Sea, and this is Jordan. Jordan is on the other side. So there is a geographical, continuity between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, according to the original plan. So this was the original plan. And now, yeah. So 1948, the Israel State of Israel was established, and Arab countries opposed it immediately, and it led to the war, the first Arab-Israel war, 1948 war. So what happened at the end of the war? So Israel did not just held on to their territories, they captured more territories during the war. So these Arab countries, I'm sorry, one second. Yeah. So Arab countries may have hoped at that time that if they come together and collectively launch an attack on Jews on the newly declared country, they could perhaps stop this new country, gathering more influence in the region or whatever. But that strategy backfired because under the British mandate or under Jewish agency, Israeli paramilitary organizations were very strong, pretty strong, and they fought well. And at the end of the war, Israel had captured some 23% more territories than what even the UN partition plan had promised. So if you look at another map,
sorry. How can I see that map? I don't.
I'm just sharing it. Yeah, can you see this now?
No, it's only your face.
Oh, the map is not. Huh?
No, where I can see the map?
It is visible. It is visible. I think you pinned
Stanley
his screen.
കാണാവുന്നതാണ്.
You need to unpin it.
Oh, okay, right. Yeah. If you look at this map, the previous map was also visible. No, in the previous map, I told you that there was geographical continuity from Gaza Strip to the West Bank. That was there in the original UN partition plan. But after the war, Israel has captured this whole territory. So basically, Gaza Strip, which is on the Mediterranean coast again, and the West Bank was cut off from each other. So Israel has captured some, 23% more territories than what even the UN had proposed. And Israel has also captured, Jerusalem city is here. So Israel had also captured the entire western half of Jerusalem. So, which is what we call West Jerusalem. That is the seat of power of the Israeli government now. Israeli parliament and the prime minister's residence, everything is in Western Jerusalem, West Jerusalem. But it's still not internationally recognized, right? That's why Indian embassy is in Tel Aviv. So 3 years ago, it became a big deal when US President Donald Trump decided to move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Why? Because Jerusalem remains a contested city. So the western half, Israel captured in the 1948 war. So in the 1948 war, Israel fought the war with Egypt. Egypt is here. So Gaza is here, and right below Gaza there is Egypt. And then Jordan is there across the Jordan River. This is Jordan River. So across the Jordan River, this is Jordan, which is Transjordan, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. And Jordan we saw Sharif Hussain. No, I referred to Sharif Hussain, who McMahon wrote a letter to. So the British gave Jordan to Sharif Hussain's family. So Sharif's son Abdullah became the first king, and Abdullah's grandson Abdullah II is now the present king of Jordan. So Jordan is there across the Jordan River, and Syria is there on the other side, on the northern side. So this is how so Israel captured. The war was basically fought between Israel, and Egypt and Jordan were the main powers. So at the end of the war, Israel captured more territories of historic Palestine, and Jordan captured West Bank and East Jerusalem, and Egypt captured Gaza. So this is what happened in the 1948 war. So Jerusalem was practically divided at the end of the war. West was with Israel, East was with Jordan. So the old city of Jerusalem, which is the holy city, that is where the Church of Holy Sepulchre of Christianity, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque and Dome of the Rock of Islam, and the Wailing Wall, everything is in the old city. So old city went with Jordan. So this is how the 1948 war divided Palestine. So after the 1948 war, actually the push for an independent Palestinian state, that has, that receded, that faded away, because, Israel had got more territories, and the remaining territories of Palestine, or the historic Palestine, were with two other countries. One bit was with Jordan, and the other strip was with Egypt. So this status quo changed in the 1967 war, because we know that by the 1960s, there is a strong Palestinian national movement coming up. In 1964, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was formed. So even before that, Fatah party was formed in the 1950s. So Fatah it's a secular radical party. So basically, they modeled themselves around the armed revolutions in the Third World. They were anti-colonialists. So they mobilized. Their program was to mobilize people and wage armed struggle against the colonialists. So in this context, the Israelis, and then attain freedom. So Fatah party was founded in 1950s. Yasser Arafat was one of the founders of the party. Yasser Arafat was a student in Cairo University, and then he joined Fatah. He founded Fatah, Yasser Arafat and others. And in 1964, Fatah and other Palestinian organizations, they came together and formed the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO. So finally, you have, a claimants for Palestinian nationalism, a movement coming up from the Palestinian territories who demanded freedom for Palestine. And they demanded freedom for historic Palestine, what they call from the sea to the river, which means the whole territory. Sea is here Mediterranean Sea, river is the Jordan River. So the whole territory is what they refer to. So 1964, PLO is there. But in 1967, Israel launched the next war. The war was launched by the Israelis. So they started bombing Egypt initially, and then it led to what we call the 6-day war. Israel fought Egypt, Jordan, Syria at the same time in 6 days. And at the end of the war, Israel captured Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula, which is here, right below Gaza. It captured Gaza and Sinai from the Egyptians. It captured Eastern Jerusalem and the whole of West Bank from the Jordanians. And it captured Golan Heights. This is Golan from the Syrians. So this was a game-changing war, So Israel established its military dominance over the region in the 1967 war, because in 6 days, it fought multiple countries and defeated them all and captured territories from. So practically, after the 1967 war, the whole of Palestine, historic Palestine, came under the Israeli control. And Israel would never leave. Even now, it's been more than 50 years since the 1967 war. Israel still controls, though Israel doesn't control directly Gaza. Israel has established a blockade on Gaza. Israel is controlling the West Bank. Israel is controlling the Golan Heights, which it captured from the Syrians. It had only given the Sinai Peninsula back to the Egyptians, which was part of the Camp David Agreement in 1978. But practically speaking, the historic Palestine, which Israel took control of in the 1967 war, is still controlled by the Israelis. And then, and then you can see, after the 1967 war, PLO has become a major resistance force. It has PLO. It would initially work from Jordan because the 1948 war had driven out some 700,000, 7 lakhs Palestinians from their houses. Because what we see as Israel today, in that area, there were hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were living, right, for generations. They were the indigenous people. And once the independent Israeli state was established, the Israeli militias, like Haganah, etc., they started driving the Palestinians away from their homes. And also, in the background, there is also this war which Israel fought with the neighboring countries. And Israel calls it the war of independence. So Israel called it the war of independence. And the Palestinians call it Nakba. Nakba is the catastrophe, because 700,000 people being driven out of their homes. It is a catastrophe. It's as simple as that. And most of them are still living in refugee camps. And in the 1960s, Jordan, because Jordan was just right across the border, so Jordan was hosting many of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees at that time. So PLO was largely operating from Jordan. But then in 1970, the Jordan's new King Hussein would crack down on the PLO, because PLO was becoming a para-state within the Jordanian state. And there were, the Jordanian king actually felt threatened by the growing influence of the PLO. So what is called the Black September, in 1970 September, I think, King Hussein launched a military campaign to drive the PLO out of Jordan, and the PLO would move from Jordan to Lebanon. And in Lebanon, again, PLO would eventually become a problem because the Israelis would go after the PLO. What the PLO did, along the Lebanese border, they would set up bases and then they would start targeting Israel from the Lebanese side. And in 1978, Israel would. So those who are asking questions, no, I can see the questions coming up. I think it would be better to ask me questions once we wrap up this session. What the PLO did, the PLO set up bases in Lebanon and started targeting Israel, and Israel would cross the border and go into Lebanon. So Israel actually invaded Lebanon in 1978. And then again in 1982, Israel would go to Lebanon again. 1982 war, a major war. And Israel would stay in Lebanon for 18 more years. Israel would be forced to withdraw from Lebanon only in 2000, mainly because of resistance by Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a Shia organization. It's a different matter altogether. So the point is that PLO yeah. There is some.
Can the admin please block?
Yeah. PLO, what I was trying to say is that PLO became the main representative of the Palestinian resistance, so the Palestinians' quest for freedom. And they've been operating from different places, first from Jordan, then from Lebanon. And Israel went to Lebanon in 1982 to drive the PLO out of Lebanon. They managed to do it. And they would move away from Lebanon to Tunis in Tunisia. And Arafat would be working from Tunisia. But by that time, PLO became a major political force within the Palestinian territories, because the Palestinian territories are now completely occupied by the Israelis, both West Bank and Gaza, two territories that are not geographically connected. So in the 1980s, Arafat would call on his supporters to rise against the occupation, to start a movement against them, a civil disobedience movement, which is what we call the First Intifada, which started in the 1987. So it is a protracted, it is a prolonged resistance movement, civil disobedience, strikes and protests, sit-ins, etc., largely peaceful, driven by the PLO factions. Arafat was its leader, and it practically made difficult for Israel to continue the occupation. And that was the main goal of the Intifada as well. And the world was also changing, in 1990s means. So Israel was coming to the terms that it is impossible for Israel unless it addresses the Palestinian quest for nationhood. Because in 1978, when the Camp David Agreement was signed between the Egyptians and the Israelis, so Sadat was the Egyptian leader, Anwar Sadat. Nasser died, and Sadat became president. In 1973, Egypt launched the Yom Kippur War on the Israelis. It was Sadat's decision, and it was a surprise war, the only war that took Israel by surprise in the region. Because interestingly, Egypt made substantial advances in the Yom Kippur War. The war happened in Sinai Peninsula, Egyptian territory controlled by the Israelis. And it was Yom Kippur is a Jewish holiday. The Israelis never saw the war coming. And the Egyptian troops went into Sinai, attacked them, and they captured Sinai, which Israel eventually recaptured. Why? Because Israel wanted offensive weapons from the Americans. At that time, there was an agreement between the Americans and the Soviets that they would not support their respective allies. The Soviet ally was the Egyptians, and the American ally was Egypt with offensive weapons, more advanced weapons. But Israel by that time had already become a nuclear power. So apparently, Israeli Prime Minister told the Americans that if we are going down, he will bring down the entire region. So these were the words used. Euphemistically, Israel was threatening to use nuclear bomb if they were not provided advanced weapons. And then the Americans came to their rescue, and Israel fought back. They captured Sinai back from the Egyptians, but still it shocked It shocked Israelis because they thought that in 1967 they established deterrence in the region. But Sadat broke into that deterrence. And why Sadat did that? Because he wanted Sinai Peninsula back. And he knew that he won't get Sinai Peninsula back unless he did something drastic. And the decision was to attack the Israelis. He knew that Egypt might lose the war at the end, but he wanted to break into Israel's deterrence confidence, Israel's deterrence theory. That's what he did. So eventually the Israelis came around and they signed Camp David Agreement, which was negotiated in the United States. And that was also the time when, Carter was the president, American president. And Carter had also put enormous pressure on the Israelis at that time to negotiate with the Egyptians. And what Anwar Sadat made one thing clear. We can say Sadat made a compromise. He signed an agreement with the Israelis. He was assassinated later. All kinds of criticisms are there. But on the other side, Sadat said that he wouldn't sign an agreement with the Israelis unless there is a framework agreement to address the Palestinian question. So the framework agreement for the Middle East was signed for the first time. So in which Israel, in theory, agreed that the Palestinians would be allowed to form a provisional government representing themselves. This was the first time in 1978 that the Israelis recognized the Palestinians' right for self-determination. So based on that, in the 1990s, they took talks further towards Oslo. So in the Oslo Accords in 1993, Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli leader, so they came together, they signed the Oslo Agreement. So this was the first agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So in the Oslo Agreement, what they decided was that Israel would allow the formation of a Palestinian Authority, which would be a provisional government that would govern the Palestinians. And in return for the PLO recognizing Israel as an independent state, which means, PLO had historically laid claims to the whole of Palestine, from the sea to the river. So in Oslo, they gave up this claim and they agreed to concede their historical claim. They agreed to recognize state of Israel, which means Israel's entity would be respected. And then in the remaining areas, state of Palestine, an independent state of Palestine would be formed. This was the basis of the Oslo Agreement, signed in 1993. Rabin would be executed in 1994. And his successor was Benjamin Netanyahu, who is now the Prime Minister of Israel. And Benjamin Netanyahu would dump the entire Oslo process. The Oslo Agreement would never go further from there. As per the Oslo Agreement, Palestinian Authority was formed. There is still a Palestinian Authority there in Israel, in Palestine. But Palestinian Authority is like one of our municipal corporations. It doesn't have even a municipal corporation's powers. Because according to Oslo, West Bank was divided into 3 areas. Area A, B, and C. And Area A would be under the governable limits of the Palestinian Authority, which means the PA can collect taxes, it can issue permits for building, it can run businesses, it can also ensure security. The Palestinian police security officials are there. And in Area B would be under the joint control of both the Israelis and the Palestinians. And Area C would remain completely out of bounds for the Palestinians and controlled by the Israelis. And then, even now there are no airports and functional airports in the Palestinian territories, neither in Gaza nor in West Bank. And all the borders are controlled by Israel. If you want to go to Palestine, I've been to Ramallah a couple of times, in Jerusalem also. If you want to go to Palestine, you will have to go to Palestine either to Jordan or through Tel Aviv, through Israel. And you have to fly to Amman or Tel Aviv and then travel by road. No airports, because air is controlled by the Israelis. the maritime routes are controlled by the Israelis, because Gaza actually shares long border with the Mediterranean Sea, but it's under the Israeli control. So practically, everything is controlled and regulated by the Israelis. It remains the same. So Palestinian Authority doesn't have much powers. And even then, let's say that the Oslo spirit is that, okay, you form the provisional government now, and then you take forward the negotiations, and then eventually you lead to the two-state solution, what they call the two-state solution. Even that didn't happen. Why? Because there were multiple efforts after that. In 2000, President Clinton hosted another Camp David talks between Yasser Arafat and Ehud Barak. Ehud Barak was the Israeli prime minister at that time. Apparently, Arafat walked out of the talks because it was, the outstanding issues were not being addressed in the talks. I'll come to the outstanding issues now. So basically, if you look at the Israeli-Palestinian issue now, one is the border. Let's say 3 outstanding issues. 1 is the border. 2, the capital. 3, the right to return of the refugees. Right? Border means Israel could be the only country in the world which doesn't have a defined border. Israel doesn't have, even officially Israel doesn't have a defined border. So it is an expansionist state, right? The UN plan proposed to something. 1948, war, Israel occupied more territories. It has expanded its border. In 1967, it occupied more territories. It expanded its border further. But after the 1967 war, it annexed Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, as part of Israel. It properly annexed the entire East Jerusalem. But people living in East Jerusalem do not have voting rights. Because, the Arab Muslims living in East Jerusalem, they can have permits. But they can't vote. They can vote in the Jerusalem municipal elections, but they can't vote in Israel's parliamentary or other elections. Yeah, it's a parliamentary system, right? It's Israel's parliamentary elections. So they don't have the voting rights, but the entire Jerusalem has been annexed as part of Israel. West Bank hasn't been annexed. But in West Bank, what Israel did, starting 1970s, when Likud first came to power, Menachem Begin came to power, what Israel did, Israel started promoting settlements. So the idea of settlements came from the original settlement, aliyahs, which the Zionists promoted. So Israel would issue subsidies to Jewish families and communities to go to West Bank and begin settlements. So build houses, you launch a community within the Palestinian territories, and then you live there. So some 400,000 Jews are now living in the West Bank. Some 300,000 Jews are there in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem as well. So settlements became. So what then Israel did, by the emergence of Hamas was founded in the 1980s, late 1980s, because compared to PLO was largely, as we said, it's a secular. Initially it was an armed revolutionary group, but later they evolved into a mainstream political organization. They also recognized Israel. They were in power in the Palestinian Authority. Hamas, on the other side, is an Islamist organization, which Hamas's original charter has called for the destruction of Israel and fight against the Jews. It has lots of anti-Semitic language as well in the original charter, which Hamas changed later on. So when Hamas emerged, Hamas had also used terror tactics in the beginning. They had used suicide bombings. They targeted Israeli civilians. Buses were blown up, etc., etc. So when this Islamist threat, Hamas became a major problem for Israel. What Israel did in the name of providing security to the settlements within the Palestinian territories, Israel started building a wall. So now there is this within the Palestinian territories, Israel has built a wall cutting into Palestinian territories surrounding the Jewish settlements. And then to regulate the movement of the Jews, to ensure their protection of the Israelis, they have also come up with this checkpoints. So what happened eventually? The end result of this is that, Palestinians, within the Palestinian territories are now living in capsules. It's like, say, I live in Chennai, and from Chennai, if I want to go to Chengalpet, which is the next district, I will have to go through the Israeli checkpoints. I'll show another map, which is pretty surprising, shocking. So this is how West Bank is now looking like. See, from where to where. So now the Palestinian territories in which the Palestinians have at least limited controls are these capsules, these white capsules. Because all others, here there are Israeli settlements, and the settlements are surrounded by the walls Israel is building. And this, these are like capsules because these capsules are surrounded by Israeli checkpoints and Israeli troops. So from one place to the other, you can't travel without getting permits from the Israelis. This is how Israel is now maintaining the status quo. So Gaza, within Gaza, there are no Israeli presence, but Gaza has been blockaded. So this small strip is the border with Egypt, which Egypt sometimes opens, sometimes shuts. So that is the only gateway for the people in Gaza to the outside world, because this is the Israeli border, which is completely been shut and sealed, and this is the Mediterranean border, again controlled by the Israelis. And so the food, the medicines, everything that has to come in and go out has to go through the Israeli checkpoints around Gaza. The blockade has been there for almost 10 years. The same is with West Bank as well. So Ramallah, you have a Palestinian authority, government is there, Ramallah. You have a Palestinian president, Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, who practically doesn't have any powers. And you see people are divided on the both sides of the wall. So from one side to the other, you can't go without getting an Israeli military permit. So this is the current situation of the Palestinian territories. So coming back to the outstanding issues. See, as I said, three problems. One is the border. So Israel's border is not defined because of this problem, because Israel eventually wants to maintain the status quo. And it also, if you look at its history, Israel keeps expanding. It would like to keep expanding its border. So eventually the whole of Palestine could be. That is the Zionist goal. And Israeli Prime Minister has said on record that a two-state solution would not happen under my watch. He said that 2 years ago during the election campaign, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And there is no peace process for quite some time because Israelis don't care. And on the other side, the Palestinians are divided because Gaza is controlled by Hamas, which is an Islamist movement, and West Bank is controlled by Fatah, the PLO. West Bank means whatever remains of the West Bank. That's controlled by Fatah, and there are problems between these two. The Hamas, ideological problems, tactical problems, and also a power struggle. They fought each other after the 2006 elections. So the Palestinians are there, even their resistance are at a weak point. And within Gaza, there are lots of other Islamist groups. There is an Islamic Jihad is there, and there are other organizations are also there who routinely, sends missiles to Iraq, and Israel would take that an excuse to come and bomb Gaza. And then in the last few years, there were multiple Israeli bombings on Gaza, which there were allegations of crimes against humanity and war crimes as well. There is a UN appointed committee, the Goldstone Committee, that studied the 2008 war, which said Israel had committed war crimes. And ICC recently, International Court of Justice recently said that it can investigate allegations of war crimes committed by Israel, which Israel made a big deal about. Anyway, these things are going on. So practically, Israel doesn't have a border. So in any final settlement, border has to be decided, right? Without border, you can't have a two-state solution. So the Palestinians, at least there is a consensus on the Palestinian side that they say that they would settle for a Palestinian state based on the 1967 border. So the 1967 border is the full of West Bank. We call it West Bank because it is on the western bank of the Jordan River, and Gaza Strip. So both PLA and even Hamas, when it changed its charter, Hamas also initially called for the liberation of Palestine from the sea to the river. But then Hamas changed its position. It said that it would settle for a long-lasting peace with Israel based on the 1967 border. But 1967 border is also now, it's disappeared because Israel had built settlements across the West Bank. And even the wall, what Israel calls security wall, what some others call an apartheid wall, the wall cuts into the 1967 border. For example, Jerusalem and Bethlehem, they are not very far. But you can, from Bethlehem, if you want to go to Jerusalem, you have to travel 1.5 hours, taking a circuitous route around the wall, going through an Israeli checkpost. There is this wall is now actually cut into Palestinian territory. So even the 1967 border would be a challenge. So recently, what the Israelis are pushing for, is that Israel would like to annex the settlements, with the Jewish settlements which Israel has built within the Palestinian territories. So if they are annexing those areas also, which means they will grab more land within the West Bank. The second issue is the capital. Because the Palestinians, again, on the Palestinian side, there is a consensus. The Palestinians have maintained that they wouldn't settle for anything other than East Jerusalem as their capital. Because East Jerusalem, as we saw earlier, is the holy city, home for all three religions' main shrines. And both Palestinians and Israelis have laid claims to East Jerusalem. The Palestinians have said that, any final settlements, nothing but East Jerusalem as the capital of future Palestinian state. Israel, on the other side, is not ready to accept this because Israel claims Jerusalem as its eternal capital. And also, Israel says that its Wailing Wall, which is the remains of the second Jewish temple according to their religion, is also an old city, so they can't just abandon the old city or give it away to the Palestinians. So deciding the capital would be a major problem. And the third issue, the most contentious issue, is the right of return. Right of return is an internationally recognized right. And there are UN resolutions that says that a refugee who's been forced away from their home, whether they are Rohingya refugees, Palestinians, or whoever, they have a right to go back to their home. This is an internationally recognized right. So which means 700,000 Palestinians and their offspring, they have a right to go back to their homes. Israel would never accept this mainly because Israel, it is a Jewish state, but they call it a secular state, but basically Israel, recently they passed a legislation also. So it is, officially it is a Jewish state. So if these many Palestinian Arabs come back who could be both Muslims and Christians, if they are allowed to come back and their children, they are allowed to come back to their houses who were forced away from these places 70 years ago, that would change Israel's demography. Israel doesn't want that to happen. So this is a critical issue in 2000 Camp David talks also, because Ehud Barak said during the talks that, no, we will never allow the refugees to come back. Israeli position is that the refugees can go back to the future Palestinian state, not to their original villages. So these are the three critical issues. Unless these issues are resolved, there won't be peace. So right now, we saw the map. We saw the exact condition of the Palestinian territories now. And Israel, on the other side, has tightened its grip. Its occupation has only deepened over the years. And the Palestinian resistance is at its weakest point because the Palestinians are divided. Mahmoud Abbas is very old. He's 80 plus. Palestinian Authority is facing allegations of corruption, leaderlessness, etc. All kind of problems are there. And there are no organized resistance also. Hamas on the other side is controlling Gaza Strip. But there are multiple Islamist organizations in Hamas as well. So this is the actual condition. But the question is, and also Israel is also enjoying international support. Despite everything despite the occupation, despite whatever is going on, Israel doesn't face any international heat at all, not even from Arab countries. Even last year, UAE established ties with Israel, Morocco, Sudan, Bahrain, and yeah, it might happen with Saudi Arabia as well. So Israel's history suggests is that Israel made concessions in the past. Okay, Israel made concessions only when it came under pressure, international pressure, or it faced with organized resistance from the Palestinians. Because in the 1957 Suez War, after Israel has captured Sinai, at that time Soviet Union was Egypt was a Soviet ally. So Nikita Khrushchev has asked Israel to vacate Sinai Peninsula, has given an ultimatum, and if you don't do it, we will start a rocket attack into Israel positions. That was a clear threat came from Moscow, and Israel withdrew. Ben Gurion withdrew from Sinai. Same like that in 1990s, in the event of the first Intifada, when it became difficult for Israel to continue to retain the status quo, Israel agreed to hold negotiations with the Palestinians, and Oslo Agreement was signed. In 1978, Israel knew that its deterrence was broken. It was chipped into by the Egyptian attack on the Yom Kippur Day, and it realized that Egypt remained a powerful military threat. It wanted to neutralize the Egyptian threat, so that it went and signed the Camp David Agreement in 1978. In 2005, after the second Intifada, which started in 2000, 5-year-long Intifada and Hamas's violent resistance to Israeli occupation, Israel decided to withdraw from Gaza Strip in 2005. So this is bad historic examples, but still, this is what history tells us. So I'll stop here, and then it's exactly 1 year. Thank you very much, and then we will look into some questions.
Thank you, sir, for the very insightful and in-depth articulation on the subject. I think we can move on to the question and answer session. Audience, please share your queries and comments in the chat box and keep away from using the microphones.
Yeah, I saw a question on Saudi Arabia stand on which I will answer that. Maybe I'll take a look at 2-3 questions. So this is popping up. Then where will I see the questions? Then it goes away.
Sir, shall I read those for you? Read the questions?
Yeah.
Okay. First one, sir. What Saudi stance on the Arab-Israeli conflict as well as Palestine?
Yeah.
Okay, that is again repeated, I think.
Yeah, I got that.
Okay, then.
Yeah, I got it. I got the question boxes. It's okay. I will look into them.
Okay, sir. Okay.
So Saudi stance and what is the motive behind the USA with Israel? Any author for EC? Yeah, author. Yeah, there are many authors. You can read Rashid Khalidi. I refer to Rashid Khalidi here. Khalidi has written enormously on Palestine. You can also read Nathan Tral. Nathan Tral was with International Crisis Group. And of course, read Edward Said. Read the Palestine Question. Biden coming to power. Don't expect any major change in Biden's approach to. Biden is one of the most pro-Israel leaders in Washington, D.C., in that shining city on the hill. So don't expect any major change. I think after Biden came to power, the U.S. Senate voted in favor of moving American embassy to Jerusalem. Only 3 lawmakers, senators, voted against it. One is Bernie Sanders, the other is Elizabeth Warren, and one more, I don't remember the name. These 2 are Democratic Socialists, both Bernie and Elizabeth Warren. So 97 American senators, including both the Democrats and Republicans, supported this. So in the United States, there is a bipartisan consensus in favor of Israel. So it is you can't expect any major shift in Biden's policy under the Biden administration towards Israel. But Biden might at least try to balance between the Israelis and the Palestinians under Trump, because Trump was the most pro-Israel president, I think, in a long time, because he looked away from everything Israel was doing. At least during Obama's time, Obama went ahead and signed the nuclear deal with the Iranians, ignoring Israeli sulking, but Trump had moved the embassy to Jerusalem and then gave a carte blanche to the Israelis for everything they did. So Biden has re-established ties with the Palestinian Authority. He might push Israel to at least freeze the settlements. He may not agree to Israel annexing the territories, but will he push Israel to make concessions? I don't think so. That won't happen. How many years do you think this issue will continue? We can't say. This is, over the last 70 years, this issue has become only more complex and worse. And I think the two-state solution is dead, because it's very difficult to find two. You saw the map, no? Where are you going to have a Palestinian state? It's impossible. And there are hundreds of thousands of Israelis, Jews are there in Palestine now. How are they going to do? Because they are also common people. Yeah, they heard their government had issued subsidy. They went and built houses. Okay, fine, they are living cozy life now compared to the Palestinians who are living under the yoke of occupation. But how are they going to shift them away? Hundreds of thousands of people. It would be calamitous for all sides. So I think eventually, maybe this discussion is coming from both sides, both the Palestinian and Arab side. Eventually, Israelis and the Palestinians should settle for some federal setup. One country, two states, something like that, where everybody, both the Palestinians and the Jews, will have equal rights before a secular constitution. So maybe, you don't know, instead of a two-state solution, there could be a one-state solution. But that one state should not be an occupied state, should not be an apartheid state. That is like apartheid fell in South Africa, right? This is, for all practical means, is an apartheid system. And Israeli leaders, Ehud Barak, it's not me, Stanley Johny saying this. Ehud Barak himself had referred to this. This is an apartheid system, because the Palestinians are, there is a highway in Israel that is connected, that is actually going through the heart of the Palestinian territories, connecting Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And this highway is not open for Palestinians. This is only for those who are living in Jerusalem, both Arabs and Jews living in Jerusalem, and the Israelis, whoever is living in Israel. The Palestinian Arabs living in the other Palestinian territories can't even travel by this highway. We call it apartheid highway. So it's that bad. If you are in Ramallah, say that you are in the Palestinian capital, and if you want to go to Tel Aviv, you can take a flight only from Tel Aviv, and you will have to hire a cab from Jerusalem, and an Arab in Jerusalem will come to Ramallah, pick you up, and then drop you in the Tel Aviv airport, because nobody from Ramallah can drop you at the Tel Aviv airport. They are not allowed to travel. So it's that bad. So I don't foresee, I think the two-state solution is practically gone. So you have to basically come up with a one-state solution where everybody will have equal rights before a constitution, and the sensitivities of the two peoples are respected, maybe in a federal structure. I don't know, I'm just overthinking, but these discussions are actually happening. And Saudi Arabia's position, I think Saudi Arabia in 2000, King Abdullah, I think at that time, I'm not sure whether he became king, but Abdullah, who became king, who was the former Saudi king, Abdullah had made a proposal which the Arab League had endorsed in 2002. According to the proposal, they actually batted for the two-state solution based on the 1967 border with East Jerusalem as the capital of a Palestinian state. And if that is achieved, Arab countries would offer recognition to Israel, all Arab countries. This was King Abdullah's proposal. And this has been the Saudi position all through. since then. And Saudi Arabia has remained a supporter of the Palestinian cause, even though Saudi Arabia has backroom contacts with Israel. But so that position, I think, is changing under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. So according to reports, which the Israelis haven't denied, the Saudis have denied, but otherwise internationally and independently confirmed, was that Mohammed bin Salman met Benjamin Netanyahu in Neom in Saudi Arabia, which is the futuristic megacity which MBS is building. So in which they held talks. So the Saudis were ready to offer recognition to Israel, but King Salman was furious, apparently, according to this report. So MBS did not even let Salman know about the UAE rapprochement. So Salman was recovering from some surgery, and then the king came to know only when the agreement was announced by Trump via Twitter. And he became angry, and then he reprimanded. That's what the Wall Street Journal report says. He reprimanded the king and the crown prince, and he said that not as long as I am alive. So, but the crown prince has actually made it clear that he is ready to live with the Israelis or even offer recognition to the Israelis. So it might happen, I think, maybe when he becomes king, if he becomes king at all, after Salman has gone. I think Saudi Arabia would have better ties with Israel because they already have very good backroom contacts with the Israelis. There are too many questions.
സർ ഇപ്പോ കഴിയുന്നത്ര ആൻസർ ചെയ്തിട്ട് ബാക്കി ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻസ് നമുക്ക് വേണേൽ മെയിൽ വഴി എങ്ങാനും ചെയ്യാം.
Yeah. Yeah, India stand, see, India has historically supported the Palestinian cause. Arafat was here for the non-alignment summits, and India had recognized State of Israel in 1948 itself. Nehru had done that, but India did not establish diplomatic relationship with Israel, which happened only in the 1990s. That was 1990s was also the time of peace process. In 1991, there was this Madrid Peace Conference. After that, even the PLO was recognizing Israel. Then India changed its position when Rao was the prime minister. And we established diplomatic ties each other. I think it was in 1992. And since then, Indo-Israeli relations have flourished. So basically, from an Indian national security point of view, Israel is now a critical partner because both countries have deepened defense relationship over the years. Israel is one of the top defense suppliers to India. But on paper, India remains committed to the Palestinians. So Prime Minister Modi visited Palestine 2 years ago. I traveled with him. I reported the event. So in Ramallah, he said that India remains supportive of the Palestinian cause, etc., etc. But if you read the fine print, India doesn't say any longer about Jerusalem, official documents. Earlier, India's position was that India supports the formation of Palestinian issue through negotiations based on the 1967 border with East Jerusalem as its capital. The last bit has gone missing under this government. And India has also historically supported Palestine. India has never voted against Palestine. India had not voted against Palestine in the international organizations. But recently, again, under this government, India had abstained from voting. But it is still like, India's position has evolved over the years because India considers, officially, I think India considers Israel as a more important ally. And India's relationship is also more transactional now than moral. After when we got independence in the 1960s and 70s, there was a moral caution in the foreign policy saying that we fought imperialism, we won independence, so we remain committed to the independence of third world countries. We are anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, etc., etc. That argument has gone missing completely. So relationship is now more transactional. So we look at what we are getting in return. So when you look at it, you don't get much from the Palestinians, but the Israelis are ready to cooperate with you on multiple fronts. So on that sense, India's relationship has overall evolved and deepened its ties with Israelis. But it remains like the international position is that you can't move away from that. If there is a voting in the UN General Assembly, UN General Assembly tomorrow, most countries would vote in favor of Palestine. So there is an international public opinion. So India goes by that. So we will wrap it up here, and then maybe we will address these questions later on. Alaga, is that okay?
Yes, yes, sir. Yes, sir. We can call it today, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. So, on behalf of Dialectic Research Forum, I thank you, sir, for investing your time and effort into this presentation. I also thank all the audience on behalf of the forum. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.